Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Well, we have a great group assembled here for Professor Noguera. We're very pleased that he is here. I am Teresa Cordova, Director, Great Cities Institute. And on behalf of Great Cities and the staff of Great Cities, as well as our co-sponsors, we'd like to welcome you. I do want to acknowledge that the College of Education is one of our co-sponsors, as is the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy and the Social Justice Initiative. And Professor Barbara Ransby is here, of course, as well as professors from the College of Education. I understand that Professor Duvall has brought his class. It's really great to see so many of the UIC students as well as people from the community. Also want to acknowledge that our dean from the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs is also here. So thank you and welcome to all of you. One of our affiliates, Tom Lenz, is with us, a GCI affiliate. So thanks again to all of you for being here. Tonight is a very special night for us. What we are going to do is begin a series and an initiative in Great Cities Institute that we refer to as Poverty to Prosperity. And as part of that series and that initiative, we will not only be convening people, but we will also be conducting research. Tonight is the launching of that effort. What better way to do it than to talk about great cities and great schools? Dr. Noguera, as you know from your program and from seeing the flyers, is not only a professor at New York University, where he has conducted extensive research in his travels across the country and other parts of the world, not only learning what are some of the best practices, but also providing some of his advice and his experience in working directly with schools to improve the quality of education. I have had the pleasure of knowing and being friends with Dr. Noguera for over 35 years, which seems really impossible. How could that be? We're only 35, right? So how could that be? And I've had the chance also not only to work at his side on various issues, but also to be in the audience to hear him speak. And one of the reasons why I was so enthused about having him come to UIC is because when this man speaks about education, he really gets it. He really nails it. He understands not only our kids, but our families, and he understands the importance of connecting issues around education to larger issues on the value and the importance of our communities. I am so grateful for the work that he does on behalf of our children. And I know that the conversation tonight will be very invigorating, because we're going to use some of that experience to build on conversations about the kinds of issues that we're thinking about here in Chicago. One of the missions, or the mission of the Great Cities Institute, is to formulate solutions to tackle the multidimensional challenges of the changing socio-political economy of cities and the metropolitan regions. We know that research can make a difference in addressing some of our urban challenges. And so for us, Great Cities Institute, it's about harnessing the power of research to create bold solutions. We're very honored that not only is CAN TV here tonight filming, and a big shout out to CAN TV. They just really provide a very, very important resource in our community. And we're also really pleased that Linda Lutton from WBEZ, another great resource in our community, is here to provide the direction for our conversation tonight. So with no further ado, let's welcome both Linda Lutton and Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Okay, so I get the privilege of interviewing somebody who tells great stories, which is what I love, and I'm going to try to stay out of the way as much as possible and just let Dr. Noguera talk. But I definitely was intrigued by the title of the series, Poverty to Prosperity. I think that really gets at the heart of what Americans believe their schools should be about. And definitely even, what we understand our nation to be about. This notion of upward mobility and economic opportunity are really at the heart of the American dream. And what I wanted to start off with was to tell you about a time I went, we had a relatively new CEO here, Jean-Claude Brizard. We've had a number of new CEOs in the last 5 years or so. I was doing a school tour with him, and we were at a school, and he made a comment where he said he believed that kids no longer saw school as a way out of poverty, as a way up the economic ladder, at least not the way past generations did. And I wonder if, first of all, if you believe that kids really don't see that, and also if he's right, if kids are seeing something that's accurate.
Well, first, thank you for spending this conversation with me tonight, and thank you, Teresa, for having me in the Institute. It's great to be here with you all tonight at UIC. I find that statement from John Claude Brizard to be so troubling. And it's really, I think, speaks to why he was a bad choice as superintendent of schools. I mean, it's not to the children to see school as the way out, right? Children come, I think, with, open minds. Most 5-year-olds you meet are excited about going to school. Not all of them, but most of them. The distaste for school develops in school, right? Too often for most children. And so whether or not they see school as a pathway out of poverty has a lot to do with their experiences within school, sometimes with what's happening beyond school as well, in home and elsewhere. But for the person in charge to say that means he doesn't understand his responsibility, right?
Well, to clarify, he wanted to change that. I mean, he saw that as a problem he wanted to address.
Yeah. But so well, that's good. And I know John Claude. I knew him when he was in New York, and I believe that he's a person who would like to see schools play that kind of a role. It's just not clear. I think a lot of people are confused about what that would mean, right? We like this idea. We like to believe in the possibility that schools could serve, or education could serve, as a pathway out of poverty. And we know that for some of us, it's worked like that. So it's not like it's such a far-fetched idea. My family came to this country as immigrants. I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, neighborhood better known for producing boxers and rap stars than professors. And so there are a number of us who can say, yes, education did provide me with a pathway to a better life. The question is, how do we make that happen for a larger number of people so it's not just exceptions? And how do we make sure that it's not the neighborhood you live in that determines whether or not you have access to an education? So I would say that many of our leaders, despite the rhetoric, are pretty much clueless about how to do that.
Tell us. No, tell us, and how often, can you give us a sense? I mean, how often is it working? What do we know about that? And then how do we get more schools like that?
So what we know from the research right now is that, for the most part, schools reproduce inequality. Right? That is, that children who start out poor stay poor. That is, that rather than a pathway to upward mobility and a better life, that for the most part, it is family income, parent education that's driving outcomes for kids. And that's been pretty consistent for a long time. There were a few periods in this country where those patterns started to deviate. 1970s, for example, starting early 80s. And there's an important paper for the students out there called "Why Aren't We Making More Progress?" And these two scholars, Barton and Coley, look at periods over the last 50 years from the War on Poverty, which is now in 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, to today. And they said, well, actually, we were making progress during that period right after school desegregation. And they attribute it to the fact that it was because we weren't just focused on schools to solve problems of poverty. We focused on housing, we focused on jobs, we focused on health, which, when you think about it, makes total sense. Why would we think schools alone could fight poverty? It's only in the last 20 years that we've thought that schools by themselves could somehow address inequality and poverty, and I would say there's very little reason to believe that that's going to work on a large scale. So I would say there's flawed logic that's not based in any sort of empirical reality that's, buttressing the policies we pursue right now.
When we look at schools, education reporters, we spend a lot of time with our graphs and such, and we like to scatter plots. We love those that plot income against student achievement. And, as you say, they pretty much show us which schools have more poor children in them. It's almost a straight line. But there are some schools, and actually I was in a college class which probably first piqued my interest in this question, where the professor posed the question, if we could produce one school, if I can show you one school that is successful in educating poor students, low-income students, why can't we do that everywhere? Why can't we do that in all schools?
So the good news is there are schools like that. There's more than one. There are hundreds like that throughout America. And they are proof that under the right conditions, all kinds of kids can learn and can achieve. That includes kids who are recent immigrants, kids with learning disabilities, kids with one parent at home, all types of children. And so the question is, why isn't that happening on a larger scale, right? Particularly in our nation's cities. And I would say it's largely because the complex combination of the conditions that need to be in place are very hard to reproduce systematically, right? So if you think about what are those conditions? Well, University of Chicago actually did a really good study on school improvement in Chicago over the last 10 to 12 years. They identified 5. You need a coherent plan for supporting instruction. Why? Because you can't just leave it to every teacher to figure it out by themselves. Right? And they need to be working together, and they need to be on the same page. You need a system for developing the skills of the teachers in an ongoing way, because the needs of the kids are changing. Right? And so what may have been good enough a year ago or 5 years ago may not be good enough now. And so that skill development in teachers has to be ongoing, right? And has to be aligned to the learning needs of the students. You need parent and community engagement, because we've known for a long time that over 50% of student outcomes is influenced by what parents are doing at home. And so how do you get parents to play that role, and how do you get the community to be involved? You need a culture in a school that affirms the value of learning, so that kids feel supported, kids feel respected, kids feel like the adults around them care about them and value them. And then lastly, you need leadership, right? Leadership that drives change. And when you think about it, that's pretty basic, right? But getting all 5 in place is tricky, right? It's hard, especially because the way we approach reform in schools is we have not worked to consciously develop capacity in those areas. Instead, we pursue reforms like gimmicks, right? And every few years, the gimmicks change, right? And so, and I've been coming to Chicago for many years, so I come through every time there's a new flavor of reform, right? And so I was here when small schools was the flavor for the moment, and now, high stakes testing, and then Common Core. And we keep thinking that if there's just this one reform, that if we just do this, it'll all work out. And we overlook those 5 essential ingredients, right? And it's, so I would say we pursue reforms through gimmicks. We don't evaluate what we do, so we don't learn from our mistakes. We do reforms to the educators, not with the educators, right? So there's no real ownership a lot of times felt at the level of the school for what's being done. And I would say that we have fixated on the wrong thing for a long time now. We've been fixated on how to raise achievement as measured by test scores, and what we've completely ignored is how to get kids excited about learning. Right? Think about the difference, right? If you fixate on achievement, you focus on test preparation, because that's what they're going to measure the achievement on. If you focus on getting kids excited about learning, you focus on getting them motivated, getting them empowered as learners, teaching becomes much more creative, right? And now, instead of kids being passive learners, they're active learners. It's so much easier to teach someone who is actively invested in learning than someone who's being forced into it.
How are you going to measure the excitement factor?
It's very easily measurable. If you wanted to, you could survey, but you have to do is go to the schools, and the kids will show it in their demeanor. They show it in their enthusiasm, all right? They show it in the fact that they actually care about what they're doing. And you know, again, schools like that exist, right? Schools like that exist. And we don't learn from those schools. We might even look at the outcomes and say the test scores, oh, I like the test scores, but we don't look at what they did to get those scores.
Do you think you measure focusing on achievement versus focusing on getting kids excited about learning? Do you think those two are like opposites, inverse? I mean, the more I'm focused on achievement, the less.
It'll be a little bit like, okay, if you want to lose weight, right?
Yeah. Well, we have to bring that.
If you wanted to. And all you did was just keep going on the scale, right? Well, it's probably not going to work very well, right? You got to actually focus on exercise and eating right and doing things that make you healthier, right?
Practice getting on the scale.
But what we've been doing is we've been putting kids on the scale, right? Testing them, right? See, are they getting any smarter? And we don't focus on, well, what do we need to do to get them to become active participants in their own education? That's the part we're not focused on.
So if I'm in a school and I'm interested in having all these stars align, right, the 5 essentials that the University of Chicago has pointed out, what can I do if I'm a teacher or I'm the principal or I'm a parent and I want that to happen? Is it just pure dumb luck, or can I somehow do something to push all those stars to align?
Well, I think an individual can't do it, right? Because schools are collective, you know, they're collective bodies, right? Everybody has to be doing it together, right? But I would say, so if you can create a sense of community around a common vision with some clarity around what we need to work on, yes, you can see people working together to steadily make improvements in what they're doing. Absolutely.
So we have a mayor here who likes very big and dramatic initiatives. He wouldn't go with the gimmick idea. He wants big, he's very impatient, and that's how he defines himself. Could you recommend some policy changes that someone with that sort of taste sensibility would like?
Well, you know, I think that if you are there's no magical solutions out there, right? And I think that's one of the problems with our policymakers. They think that's why they seize on gimmicks. They think if we could just do this, voila, it'll be great schools. Let's do charters, voila, they'll all be fine, right? It doesn't work like that. So I would take your mayor and have him visit Toronto, right? Not to smoke crack with that mayor, right? But Toronto has pursued a different strategy, right? Toronto has focused on capacity building in schools, right? Where they actually go in. So if a school's not performing, they go in and say, okay, what do we need to focus on at this school to help improve the outcomes? And a lot of it is those 5 essentials, right? And Toronto has improved more high-poverty schools than any city in North America. So I'd say go visit that crack-smoking mayor up there in Toronto. He may not know what's going on, but he might be able to take him to some schools.
Can we talk about school closings a little bit as a strategy for improving schools? In 2004, Mayor Daley here announced the Renaissance 2010 initiative. The idea was to create 100 new schools in 5 years. We also closed many low-performing schools in that time, chronically low-performing schools that the school system felt every effort had been made at reform, and those schools were still not doing well by kids. And we've closed many schools, 50 most recently in one fell swoop. This is not an initiative unique to Chicago.
Right. New York City closed 160 under Mike Bloomberg in 12-year period. You know, closing schools, now let's be truthful. Some of the schools you go into, these are not schools fit for anyone, right? They're dysfunctional. Kids aren't learning there. So I don't want to romanticize some of these schools they are deeply troubled schools. But I'll give you an example. I was just talking about this a moment ago. It's a school in Washington, D.C. It is, by any definition, a failing school that spends a whole lot of money, right, on all kinds of things, none of which help kids to learn to read. Right? They have a marching band at that school that'll blow you away. The marching band, not only do all the kids who play in this band did not play an instrument before coming to high school. And not only do they play an instrument, they dance while they play it. So they get invited all around the world to go and perform. Now, I would say this. If you could get these kids to dance and play instruments, you could probably get them to read too, right? It's a question of where our priorities are. I would also say that if you have a band like that, that is an evidence of an asset already in the school that you build upon, right? So rather than shutting it down, the question I would ask is, how do we do more of what works, right? How do we build on our successes and get very clear about what needs to change? And sometimes what needs to change, you got the wrong people there. You have people in some of the schools who don't even like kids, right? And the kids know it, and they know it. You have people who are afraid of kids, right? And that combination will never work, right? So, but you have to be clear about what needs to change. We've been reforming schools without any clarity at all about what the problem is that we need to solve. Right? So I go to schools, they say, okay, we're gonna make it a small school. Why? Why small? Not all small schools are good. There are many bad small schools, right? But we spent Gates Foundation $2 billion on small schools before they realized, oh, not working. Right? So we need to be much more thoughtful in how we approach it and how we think about change and what needs to change.
On this issue of school closings, you know, many of the schools in the most recent round, 50 schools closed, 49 grammar schools. You know, those were at the heart of neighborhoods, often incredibly economically disinvested neighborhoods. Many times I'm reporting in neighborhoods, and I think a lot of Chicagoans even would just be shocked at what some communities really look like, street by street, block by block. You're a sociologist. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the connection. We're talking about connecting communities and schools. What is the connection? What do we know about a connection between communities, poverty, and schools?
Well, we know that in our most economically depressed neighborhoods, our schools are some of our most stable institutions. When the banks leave, grocery stores leave, school's still there, right? Schools and the liquor stores and the churches. And for many kids, school might be the only place where they're guaranteed a meal, maybe two. Right? Heat in the winter, adult supervision. And so what we need to keep in mind is our public schools are really the basis of the social safety net in America for kids, for poor kids especially. Right? Now, having said that, schools are closing because nobody wants to go there anymore. People have chosen to not send their children there for whatever reason, and there simply aren't enough kids there to keep it viable. And therefore, we have to ask the question, well, what does it take to renew and to revitalize schools? And I would say, apropos for the title of the event tonight, if you can't think about revitalizing a city without also having schools that anchor that attempt at rebuilding. So let me give you an example of a school in South Africa. I work in the townships outside of Port Elizabeth. And here you talk about poverty. These are townships, much more intense poverty than most communities in this country. Right? You know, over 80% unemployment. This particular area, over 40% of the adults with HIV, HIV positive. Large numbers of children who are orphans because of the HIV rates. The school was falling apart. Right? It was being vandalized. Teachers weren't coming, kids weren't coming. So a new principal's assigned there. First thing he's got to do is figure out, okay, how do I get the school organized? So he decides immediately he's going to hold a party for the community. He calls it a Thanksgiving party. Right? And they said, what are you giving thanks for? He said, I'm giving thanks for your support. So they laughed, they said, well, we haven't supported you. He said, exactly, until you support me, We cannot get this school back. So they come, people have food. He says, we need to get the school. We need to get the school going again. He says, the first thing we got to do is stop the vandalism. They said, we know the guys who have been vandalizing. He said, they call Tutsi in the area who don't have jobs, so they rip off the school. He said, let me meet them. He meets with the guys who've been robbing the school. He makes a deal that they will do security at the school in exchange for free housing on site. He then says, we got to figure out a way to feed the kids. The kids are not coming to school because they're hungry. He starts a garden on site with parents that staff the garden, split the food between themselves and the children. They start a clinic on site, staffed by parents, again, mostly mothers who are not trained, but are there staffing a clinic. I said, what happens if a child is really sick? They say, we give them some water and rub their head, and usually it works, right? Until a nurse comes, right? They have turned a school that was totally non-functional into a vibrant learning community, staffed by over 100 parents a day, none of whom gets paid. Over and over again, I kept asking these parents, how do you, what makes you come? How do you do this if you're not getting paid? They said, well, our kids are here. And one of them said, I wasn't doing anything anyway. I was at home doing nothing. And now I'm part of something. And I cite this as an example because they knew they could not simply wait on the government to help them. The government wasn't going to help them. Right? They had the wherewithal to realize that if they organized themselves in the interest of their children, they could do something. They could. Every classroom you visit has 5 and 6 parents working with teachers as volunteers. And these are classrooms with 40 and 50 kids. So if you can do that under those conditions, now do they have the same education as wealthy white children in Johannesburg? Absolutely not. But do they have a better education than they had before? Definitely. And I think that in too many of our communities, what I see is we are waiting. We are waiting for someone to save us, waiting for someone to fix it, waiting for the mayor, waiting for the superintendent, waiting for somebody, and they're not coming, right? And we have to seize it, our schools, and organize ourselves to ensure that our children get the education they need.
Maybe they're waiting for the charter school.
The charter schools, think about it, the whole model of the charter school is parents not as partners, parents as consumers. Right? It's a very different way of thinking about the way a school engages a community. Right? If you don't like what the charter school does, go someplace else. Right? Parents typically, there are some exceptions here, but parents typically don't have a lot of say in what happens in that school. Right? So it's a different model than what I just described. This is really a partnership between the parents and the educators.
So in Chicago, as we've added the new schools and closed other schools, the new schools that we've opened here have tended to be open enrollment, citywide enrollment, not based on a neighborhood. And the schools we've closed have overwhelmingly been neighborhood attendance area schools. And I wonder if you can imagine or if you know anything about what that might do to the actual communities where schools are located. What sort of a difference does it make to have a school that's geographically based? It sounds right, especially in a city like Chicago, to have your zip code not determine your school.
Sure.
Because we are so segregated, and there are pockets where children, I think many people would agree, shouldn't have to be subject to a particular school. So talk a little bit about the connection between community and schools not being place-based, admission-based anymore.
Well, I would say it's true that you shouldn't be limited to the school in your neighborhood, but it also should be that you should have that option available if you want it, right? That is that most parents, when thinking about where they want their children to go to school, access and convenience is at least a factor, right? Is it close? Could they walk there? Can I walk there? Can I be involved with the teachers? So I think it's a mistake to eliminate the neighborhood as a part of the school community. But at the same time, I think especially for high schools, we need not be limited to that at all in the way we think about how schools serve communities. But again, I go back to what I said earlier. Schools should be institutions that help to bring stability to a community. Right? If the school is high functioning, it impacts property values, it impacts the quality of life in that community. And so there's a relationship between the neighborhood and the school. They both benefit in the same way as they could both be harmed. If the school is bad, it actually contributes to the deterioration of the community. So I think it's a mistake not to recognize that that relationship is an important one and needs to be thought about. When we think about trying to improve neighborhoods, we've got to think about what role schools can play in that process. I think it's short-sighted not to consider that.
I mentioned Chicago being a very segregated place. Our schools, actually, this new sort of system that we have, where we have sort of a mix of neighborhood schools and choice schools, schools are becoming more segregated. Our top schools are becoming more filled with middle-income kids rather than poor kids, so that the schools that kids have to test into. African-American kids and Latino kids are more likely now than they were 20 years ago to go to school with kids from their own race. We have fewer integrated schools. I'm citing numbers that WBEZ analyzed, and you can see these on the website. We have fewer number of integrated schools, and by that I mean no majority schools, so schools that are mixed, no majority schools. Far fewer than we had 20 years ago. And the question I want to pose is, does that matter? These are things that people really don't talk about too much anymore. We're very focused on achievement. Does any of that matter?
Well, it does matter, especially this has been the 60th anniversary of the Brown decision, right? I think it's ironic, given, this country fought a war over school desegregation, literally blood in the streets in some places over this, and to have it not even be the focus of discussion amongst our policymakers, either in Washington or in the state capitals, I think says a lot about what we accept. It matters because what we're doing now is we're concentrating the most disadvantaged kids in schools with the fewest resources, right? So not only haven't we lived up to the goals of Brown, we don't even live up to the goals of Plessy, right? Plessy was separate but equal, right? We have separate and profoundly unequal, right? So it definitely matters. Now you could say, well, if we equalize the resources, would it matter less? I think most parents want a good education for their kids, and they're far more concerned about the quality of education they receive than than who they're sitting with. But I think as a society, we should be concerned about that. I think America is becoming a more and more diverse society. We will be a nation where the majority of people are people of color by 2040. And so the question is, will we know how to live together? Will it hold us together as a country if people aren't educated together? And so I think that our political leaders should be far more concerned about what's happening with respect to the composition of our schools than they are. But in the short term, I would say that the real critical issue is the quality of education children receive, resources. We talk about the achievement gap. We never talk about the resource gap, right, in schools. The fact that some kids are going to schools with no libraries, with no lab equipment, basic ingredients not present in the schools. And so, equity's got to be at the center of any kind of serious change effort. But I do think these issues around integration also have to be tackled. But we have to be more creative, because here's the truth, the sad truth. You can't make middle-class people of any race put their kids in bad schools. Right? You can only do that to poor people. Middle-class people will choose to go to private schools. They will choose to find their way to get their kids in some other part of town. They will get away, right? Or in some nice magnet school. It's only poor people whose kids don't have that option, right? Now, a lot of people who advocate choice point to this as the unfairness of the current system. I would say this is an example of the ways in which class, privilege, works to and make it possible for people with resources to continue to get what they need for their children, even though the public institutions are failing. And it's one of the reasons why, if you think about it, the analogy I would make is this. New York City subways are remarkable. I think they put your subways here to shame. All right? And what they're remarkable because they're so equitable, right? It's the only place where you will find rich and poor side by side, right? On a train. Homeless man next to a guy going down to Wall Street, right? And they are relatively safe. They are relatively cheap. And they take you 4 million people a day take the subway in New York City. Our schools should be like the subways. It shouldn't matter what neighborhood you are in. You could be pretty much guaranteed that if I'm at a public school, I should know certain resources will be present because the city controls this, and it shouldn't matter. If it's in the south side or the west side or the north side, shouldn't matter. That should be, when we talk about equity, it should be equity in terms of the quality of what we're providing to all families.
So how do we get there? What kind of policies does a city have to invent or?
Well, I talked before about capacity building. If capacity building were the lens, so if you go to Toronto, again, and you went to schools in the kind of more high poverty immigrant areas, you're not going to find dilapidated schools that don't have adequate resources. You're going to find very similar learning conditions as what you would find in more affluent areas. Now, you also have a healthcare system, and you got a bunch of other things that we don't have. But just in terms of education, a much more equitable system than we have. So if capacity building were the goal, right, we're going to build the capacity of each of these schools to meet the needs of the students they serve, then we would go into the different neighborhoods and we would say, when we look at a school, we wouldn't say, should be saved or closed? We would say, what does that school need to meet the needs of the students it's serving right now? Different question.
I should say, I think Chicago's maybe started down that path a little bit. We have a new office called OS4, and it's maybe because of so many, and maybe educators here have a better idea about how OS4 is really working in practice. But OS4, which I can't remember the 4 O's right now, or the 4 S's, but it's, essentially if you're a chronically low-performing school, before we actually shut you down now, we are going to take a look and figure out if we can assist you or justify you being shut down.
Well, I can't comment because I don't know how well it works, but it just makes sense, that, again, to be much more thoughtful in how you approach it than I've seen. I mean, New York City, as I said, they shut down schools they created,
Yeah, we just did that for the first time, too.
And at one point I asked Klein, when he was the chancellor, I said, you talk about accountability, what are you accountable for? Right? And he said, well, I'm accountable for holding everybody else accountable. And that's the kind of rhetoric that they use. And I said we have to challenge the policymakers on, they talk about evidence-based policy. Where's the evidence that their policies are working, right? Where's the evidence that the policies are resulting in genuine improvement for a greater number of children?
Yeah, I think the idea, though, is, let's risk, right? Let's go out there, let's try something. And they say, well, even if it's something we created, if it's not working, we close it down. Kids can't wait another day. You don't buy that argument?
Well, listen, I would say there might be times when we decide, and nothing else has worked, this thing's got to close, right? It's not happening. But that should be the last resort. But when I see it become built into policy, that's what we do, then I think this is just another way to disregard a community. I mean, it is so disruptive to a community to have a school shut down, right? So the consequences of that have to be borne, also thought out when you're considering what to do about a school.
So I want to go back to your idea, sort of an idea of what school should feel like, right? This idea that school should be a place where kids get excited about learning. And when I cover, it's a very diverse district. We have the very best schools in the state in Chicago and also the very lowest performing schools in the state. The parent demands, the middle class parents tend to demand progressive education, well-rounded curriculum, literature, arts, foreign language, a second language. And when I visit schools in very poor communities, those schools often look very different than what middle-class parents are laying out for what they want for their children. Do poor kids and middle income kids need two different types of schools?
No. Well, let me qualify that. Not in terms of the resource access. Right? I mean, I could take you to school in the South Bronx. You know, we have very fancy names for our schools. MS 223, right? Middle School 223. Ramon Gonzalez is the principal there. I mean, the kids are getting an enriched education that would rival what you would see in any affluent community, even though these are very poor kids from the South Bronx. So yes, they need the same kinds of things in terms of stimulation and exposure. Now, where you find there might be some differences, right, is in what we call progressive education. And I'm a little concerned about this right now with the push to preschool. Because, you know, as some of you know, the mayor of New York wants to do universal preschool like tomorrow, right? Which already concerns me because I don't think you could do high quality preschool quickly. I think you need to do it thoughtfully and carefully. But how are they going to be taught? Affluent parents like to focus on play. You know why? Because they're teaching the kids to read at home, right? And so those kids are going to kindergarten, they already can read because their parents did it. Poor kids, if they just get play, they come to school behind. So we've got to figure out a way to get a balance. Not to say they don't do play, but they need to get some more than just play. They need to get some exposure to early literacy, numeracy, and those debates amongst the educators are pretty sharp right now about what's best for children. And I do think, depending upon the resources of families, that there might be some differences in need with respect to, based on class, and the education level of parents.
And does that continue on up through grades?
It does. If you think about it, for example, homework is an equity issue. Right? If you don't have access to an educated parent and a computer, you're always at a disadvantage. Right? You ever see some of those kids? They bring a diorama, it looks like an architect did it, right? And then you find out their dad is an architect, right? And he did it, right? I mean, you talk to affluent parents, they are investing so much in their children. Private tutors, piano lessons, they're not leaving anything to chance. Then you go to working class parents, they don't either have the time or they don't even know that they're supposed to be involved at the same degree as these affluent parents. And so it's a very uneven playing field, and it contributes to the unequal outcomes.
I want to ask about no excuses schools, and how much do you think that a shift in attitude among educators and among the school staff, that we're really not going to let our students' poverty impact or determine their outcomes? We are going to take responsibility for everything about their education. How much can just that simple shift in attitude, how much can it be a game changer?
Well, it can't be a slogan, though, right? And a lot of times I think that something like no excuses is nothing more than a slogan. Some kids have excuses, right? They got legitimate excuses. They got, you know, issues that are making it difficult for them to get to school regularly, or make it difficult for them to concentrate because there's no heat at home, or, you know, there's other challenges in their family life. And so we can't let no excuses mean we're going to ignore your needs, right? We've got to try to do our best as we can to respond to the needs, the non-academic needs kids have, so that we can focus on the learning, right? And that's why you have to have social workers, and you have to have school psychologists and other kinds of professionals working with educators, particularly in high poverty areas, to address those other needs. At the same time, the idea that we're not going to let poverty become an excuse to high expectations, I agree with completely. Right? I think, and it concerns me sometimes when you hear people who say, well, these kids, what could you expect of these kids? And I do think that is a real problem in many schools. And what often goes with that is a tendency to blame their parents as being the source of the problem. So getting it right means you understand what are the needs of the children. You also understand what are their strengths, and how do you build on those strengths in the children, and then how do I work with those families to support the children.
I want to get to questions from the audience, but I wanted maybe to ask you if you have a favorite high poverty school, and if you could tell us about, just tell us a little bit about it, what you like about it, what attracted your attention.
Well, I have several, but I'll just describe one. PS 28 in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. Principal there, Sadie Silva, kept inviting me to her school. And finally, I got out there. It's very far out, deep in Brooklyn. And I get there. She introduces me to her secretary. She said, "This is the person who does all the administrative work." I said, "Oh, that's great." I said, "Well, what do you do?" She says, "I'm the lead teacher." She said, "I didn't become a principal to escape the classroom." I said, "Come on, let's go visit some classrooms." So first thing I noticed when we get to the classrooms is 4 and 5 adults in every classroom. So I'm wondering, how do you get all these teachers? She said, "Well, they're not all teachers." Her school, 25% of her students are special ed students, they're IEP. So she has a large number of special ed teachers. So most classrooms, they have a push-in model, special ed teacher working with the regular classroom teacher. Kids can't tell the difference because they work together as a team. The others are parents. In every room, there are parents trained to work with teachers as volunteers. Again, not getting paid. I see one parent standing very close to a little boy. I said, "Why is she so close to him?" And she's not doing anything but standing there. And she said, "Well, she's keeping him calm. And we're glad she's here." 40% of the students at the school are homeless. 40%. She says that she has developed partnerships with the YMCA. They provide an after-school program based at her school so that there's a second shift. Kids are there getting homework help, math, music, robotics, chess, swimming lessons. I said, "How do you get that?" She said, "I just went to the Y and said, I got your kids. You need to be here with me." And she's pretty forceful principal. She has another partnership with a job training agency. Parents who want to can get GED classes, they can get job training, they can get English classes. Again, she believes parents are educated and employed, they'll do a better job for their children. She makes the space available to the Community Development Corporation to use her site. She has a partnership with a medical school not far away. An optometrist comes to school once a month. There's a nurse on site. There's a dentist that comes in once a month. Again, focused on the health needs of kids. I cite this school because in addition to having all these systems in place, I sat in on a professional development session she had going on for teachers, led by 2 social workers, on how to respond to the social and emotional needs of children. And they're taking questions from the parents, not the parents, the teachers, who are describing issues with children. One says, "I've got a kid who's fighting," another one's got a kid who's depressed, another one's got a kid with attachment issues. And they're giving them practical suggestions on what to do. So I asked Sadie, "What made you decide to offer this as professional development for your teachers?" She said, "Until I did, they were sending too many kids to special. They were referring them for IEPs." She said, "My teachers have to be more skilled to work here." That's the capacity building part. She said, "Let me introduce you to my guidance counselor." And so we go down the hall. She says, "I got him from the rubber room." Rubber room is the place where, in New York City, I don't know if you have that here in Chicago, but if you've been written up for something, you could be sent to this place. You report there, you get paid, but you don't have any contact with children. You could sometimes be there for years, right, collecting checks. I said, "How do you know to get this man from the rubber room?" So she said, "Well, he had been my guidance counselor when I was in school. And he literally saved my life. And so when I heard he was there, I asked, could I have him? They said, you could have him." So I go in there, and he's there with a little boy, and they're talking very casually, so I introduce myself to both. I asked the little boy, "Why are you here?" He says, "I'm here to learn how to be good." So I said, "Is it working?" He says, "Yes, I hope so, at least, because I'm tired of being put out of class." And then they explained to me their policy at the school is no suspensions. No suspensions. So they really do try to get at how to help kids control their behavior. So before I leave, I tell her I'm going to write to the chancellor and tell him what I'd see. So she said, "Well, if you're going to write to the chancellor, I've got to show you one more thing." She takes me to her office. Her office is set up like a classroom with a big table and chairs. I said, "What happens here?" She said, "I told you, I'm working with kids all day long that the teachers have trouble with." And then she shows me that for every single student in the school, there is a portfolio of their work and a learning plan for the student. And they're monitoring every single, nothing is left to chance. That school got the highest gains in literacy and math in Brooklyn in 2011. Now, I would say, what makes that school work? A lot of it is Sadie, right? The principal. You know, she's there all day long. Her own daughter goes to the school, which she said if her daughter didn't go there, she wouldn't see her. But she has a total, her partnership, her union rep was, you know, like one of the leaders at the school in the work going on, and PD for other teachers. The partnership, all the things I decided before, we mentioned before, those essential ingredients, present at the school. And so, again, it's a reminder of what's possible when you bring those elements together. And there are schools like that, others like that I visited, not just in New York and other places as well, that remind me of that we can do this. We can do much better than we do now.
All right. That's a great place to leave it for audience questions.
My name's Lori Glenn, and it's such a pleasure to hear you speak. Thank you so much for, I think, all of us, you know. And thank you, Linda, as always. So Bruce Dold, who's the editor of the editorial page of the Chicago Tribune, had the pleasure of interviewing Barbara Bird Bennett. I'm sorry, I'm sick. Barbara Bird Bennett, who is, you know, our CEO of our Chicago Public Schools. And Bruce is a friend, and he took my question as the first question. I had put it in the email I'd sent. I had no idea this would happen. And my question was to Ms. Bennett, so if you're going to close all these schools, you know, and maybe some of these schools, like you said, Professor Noguera, have to be closed because maybe they're not good schools. But really, given the fact that schools are a center of a community so often, wouldn't it be better if maybe we did it over a period of time? I mean, if legitimately there are schools that need to be closed, then the community should be engaged in these closings, and what does that look like? And her response was, and she's very good at this, I know we're being taped, I'll never work in this town again, but she said, oh, well, you know, it's like, smiled, a bandage. Right, Band-Aid? You know, you want to rip it off really fast so you get the pain over with right away. So I was kind of aghast at that answer because it seemed like a lot of community pain to happen all at one time. My question to you is, if Barbara Bird Bennett was your client and she came to you and said, well, we're going to close 50 schools, what would you say to her? Do it all at one time and get the pain over with? Or what would we as a community do better to be able to engage our residents, our students, our teachers, our parents, and all the stakeholders? What would you advise our administration to do differently? But you're not on the spot. Thank you.
You know, it's hard for me to answer the question because I don't have all the information. I know that some of what was going on, at least from what I've been told, some of it was financial, some of it was about enrollment patterns. The way they describe it is consolidation of schools. And so I would want to know, I would want to look at a map, and I would want to know about how neighborhoods are being impacted. Right? Again, schools need, neighborhoods need their schools, right? And so I'd want to make sure that no one neighborhood was being overly impacted by these closures, right? And to the degree that we had to have pain, we need to have shared pain, right? And not just a disproportionate amount felt in certain areas. So again, I'm putting that out without having access to all the information when the decisions were being made. Let's also be clear that this issue of school closures has happened in many cities across the country right now. And you know, in New York, it's part of their reform strategy under Bloomberg. In Seattle, it was again about shrinking enrollment. Pittsburgh, the sad thing, Pittsburgh, they were closing schools. As soon as the public school would close a school, a charter school would open up and it would be full, right? Okay, so it tells you there's something else going on, right? And so we need to just make sure we have all the information about both what's happening, why is the school not performing, if that's part of it, And also, how is the community going to be impacted by the decision?
What about the pace?
The pace, you know, again, that depends a lot on finances. I don't know if how much the pressing issue is budget, right? So I just don't have enough information to answer that one.
Hi, my name is Lucretia Burtz. Hi, Linda. I'm a former CPS student. I also attended a charter school in the city, and I've recently worked in schools, and I witnessed, you know, high stakes like testing and all that. And so as we sit in this institution, I wonder, do colleges play a role in high stakes testing in schools, such as elementary schools and high schools? And if so, what can they do to, to better improve this?
Well, that's a good question, and they absolutely do, because a lot of this testing is based on, at least theoretically, the goal of getting more students who are actually prepared for college. Okay? I was told today that 90% of the kids in Chicago have to take remedial courses when they go to college. 90%. New York City, it's 80%. What that suggests is there's a lot missing from their high school preparation, right? So then I think we have to go backwards and say, okay, what needs to be done differently so that kids are better prepared, because a lot of times those remedial courses don't even get credit for, right? And it's a big factor contributing to kids dropping out of college. Now in New York City, we have 38 schools that do performance-based assessment. What's different about that is you actually have to produce something. So to give you an example, my daughter went to a school like that, School of the Future, public school in Manhattan. In every grade, you do an exhibition on a different subject in each year. You work on that exhibition with a teacher over the course of the entire year. By the end of the year, you have a product, something you produce. So it's not simply that you can pass a test, it's what have you produced. So as a 9th grader, she did her history exhibition. She decided she was going to compare the Roman and the Inca empires. She had to have multiple sources. By the end of the year, she has a 25-page research paper that she's worked on in phases, right? And then she has to present that paper to teachers, students, and parents. Only 3 grades are possible: distinction, competence, or do-over. Do-over. To me, if you can write a 25-page paper as a 9th grader, chances are you're going to be much more likely to be college ready at the other end. And the process they use of revise, resubmit is actually a much better learning process for a student, because in that way they're learning from their mistakes, they're learning, getting a clearer sense of what the standard is that there's to be held against. That's much more effective as a learning strategy than simply preparing for a high-stakes exam.
Go ahead, Lucretia. Lucretia and I used to work together. She was a fellow at WBEZ, excellent reporter.
I was going to say, like, in what you just said, you sort of put like the focus on high schools, but like we already know that our kids are suffering. I'm one of those kids, right? So like I know that when I graduated or when I completed, you know, my requirements for high school, I wasn't at the level to attend college. So what can colleges do? Because you know that there's a need. What can they do? What can you guys do?
Okay, well that's a good, okay, that's what you're saying. So universities, especially public universities, but not only, I think have an obligation, a social obligation to support the schools in the community. Right? It's not good enough to say, are you ready for college? They need to be engaged with schools to help the schools in the work. Right? And that should not just be up to the School of Education. Right? The university has lots of resources. Right? We should be having history professors meeting with history teachers about how do we make that curriculum come to life? Right? How do we get our kids motivated to want to study history or to study science? We should think much more creatively than we do about how higher ed institutions work with public schools. There are very few examples of this being done well right now around the country. Right now, it tends to be that universities are very, very bad in the way of their citizenship and what they give back to community.
Good evening. My name is Dennis O'Neill, and that was a perfect lead-in to my question. I'm wondering if you could discuss institutional culpability in the disparities in education. And we'll use the community in which we are all sitting and in which I have lived for 34 years, is a case study. It's approximately 1 square mile. It's bounded by 2 interstate expressway systems, a large elevated railroad, and a busy street called Ashland Avenue on the west, next to the largest medical district in the country, Illinois Medical District. This is the largest public university in the state of Illinois. And we have, because Chicago likes to do everything big, or at least claims we like to, we have the largest, one of the largest federal redevelopments of public housing in the country, and one of the most incomplete in this community, called the Obla development. Started under Hope 6. Mayor Emanuel was, right after Hope 6 was passed, became senior advisor to Bill Clinton. And this development has cost $200 million to date. It's resulted in only about 1,000 units of housing. There's still 80 vacant acres left to be developed. And it was preceded by the largest expansion of this campus in its history, which was the South Campus development. And our community asked for education planning, beginning with the South Campus development. We were denied it. Built about 2,000 units of housing just south of here. And we asked for it in the Hope 6 planning. And somebody, you mentioned Brown versus Board and Plessy. You didn't mention the largest desegregation case and the longest in housing. That's from Chicago. It's the Gautreaux et al. Versus Chicago Housing Authority and HUD case. It's almost 50 years old. And somebody thought it was a great idea under Hope 6, because apparently this was the intent, to racially segregate. So we closed 4 failing schools. I was on the local school council, the Jacob A. Reese Elementary School in the mid-90s, which served Jane Addams, one of the largest public housing developments in Chicago, one of the first also in the country. And they racially isolated and segregated all the children in the only open enrollment neighborhood elementary school serving this 1 square mile community called John M. Smith Elementary. They did this over a period of 8 years. Fascinating. Nothing like hope and transformation, right? The CHA Plan for Transformation. The institutions, CHA, CPS, BP, Business and Professional People for the Public Interest, the MacArthur Foundation funded this, Chicago Housing Authority, Chicago Public School Systems.
Mr. O'Neill,
Like, what do
I
we,
got to
so
ask you
well, how,
to
could
make your
discuss the
question.
institutional culpability. Well, how do you write that?
Well, you know, I don't know how you write it, right? Because, as you said, it's happened over many years. A lot of the, I don't even know if a lot of the players are still present. Let me describe the alternative, right? Alternative is Boston. All racist Boston, right? Where there was blood on the streets over school desegregation. The only community I know of in the country that has been revitalized without displacing poor people is in Boston, the Dudley neighborhood.
Dudley, yeah.
Right? And what's interesting is not only and how did it happen? It was happened through total community engagement and community ownership of the process, and it happened over almost a 30-year period. And now there's more housing than there was when they started, and it's a stable, thriving community. So there is another way, other than the Chicago way. I would say the real question now is, what are we going to do? If we can't remake the history, what do we do now? What does this university do to try to make right for some of the damage that's been inflicted upon the community? I mean, if they have 80 acres of undeveloped property still, that's an opportunity to do some model schools here, right? That the university takes some real control over, and it puts its own resources into as a way to kind of compensate this community for what it's lost. So I would, but again, you know, what the Dudley example is important for is it really, you know, we use terms like empowerment as, you know, very flippantly. It is genuine empowerment, what you see in Dudley. It was community-led, and that's what I think sets it apart. In most of these other cases, it's the elite decision makers deciding the fate of communities. No one's ever consulting with people who actually live in the community about what's going to happen, what are the consequences, the implications of these decisions. That didn't happen in Boston. And it's an interesting story about why it happened that way.
Prophet, it's always good to see you. Just a quick question. I appreciate when you talked about charter schools and charter schools positioning parents as consumers. What I'm also seeing is that principals are being positioned as managers. So if we think about that consumer-manager relationship, what can we do to interrupt this notion of principal as manager? Because I think, like I said, we got all this social justice stuff happening. We got a good idea on how to train teachers, but it seems like the principalship just is kind of left to the wind. So what are some things that we could actually do, like Ms. Silva, to train this justice-oriented principal?
That's a good question. You know, I think we seize on things like the manager kind of metaphor as a way to think about the principalship, because we're hoping that the kind of technocratic expertise of corporate management could then help schools to become more efficient, right? That's the hope. But then what we lose sight of the fact is business schools are not like businesses or corporations. They're very different. And that you know, a person like Sadie Silva, her image as a leader is not, she said, I'm the lead teacher, not I'm the CEO of the school. Right? A very different way of thinking about her role and her relationship to her colleagues, her students, and the parents. And so I think what's important is to give principals in training or future leaders a chance to learn from people like that. Right? You know, that's the hardest thing to do. You know, a colleague of mine, Jerry Murphy at Harvard, he used to say, you know, being a principal is like being a sea captain. Right? You know, you don't learn to be a sea captain in a classroom. You learn at sea. Right? Hopefully you learn under a good captain. Because there's so much of what a captain knows that's about judgment and discretion. Right? How do you train someone to have good judgment? Right? How do you train someone to have compassion, to know how to make tough decisions? Right? These are the things that you could own, and not everybody, even if you apprentice under somebody good, you might realize, I'm not cut out for that. Right? But we need to figure out ways to give people a chance to see good leadership so that they can learn and have a clear vision in mind of what it looks like. You know, it's interesting, in sports, that's how we do it, don't we? Right? You know, someone has a really good basketball team, next thing you know, their assistant is hired someplace else to lead somebody else, weak team, right? Because we know, oh, okay, they know what they're doing, we're gonna follow that example. We don't do that in education. You know, we take people, very often we'll take people with no experience or, you know, when it comes to superintendents, people with a track record of failure, say, okay, we're gonna try you out again, see, maybe this time you might be better. It's crazy.
So one of the most depressing thing about school districts in general is the manipulation and abuse of data in general. Specifically, there's a lot of misrepresentation of data and not understanding the subjectivity of it. Classic example would be the charter school that claims 100% graduation rate, but is systematically pushing out kids and telling them not to use their native language. So I guess my question would be for both Linda and Pedro. How cynical and skeptical you are of educational data in general, and how have you learned to dig deeper?
You want to go first? You're the muckraking journalist.
You don't like my charts? I mean, I think, you know, my job is to figure out what is really behind those numbers and understand and give the public an understanding of what those numbers really mean. And I do get tired sometimes where I feel like I'm just constantly fact-checking the school district lately, because things that are stated don't seem to, once you look harder at what they're talking about, they're not supported by facts, or they're supported by part of the facts and not the other part. So I think my job as a journalist is just to investigate those issues and tell you what the numbers actually mean. What do you think about these numbers?
I would say the same thing. I think that you know, that's one role that, you know, again, university-based researchers can play, is to look closely at that data, look at attrition, look at who's being served. You know, a lot of times the charter schools will say, well, we have a lottery, right, as a way, as if that guarantees random access. Well, we know now that there are a lot of families, the high-need families aren't in the lottery. Right? If you're undocumented, you don't show up for a lottery, right? There are a lot of families that don't even know a lottery is taking place. Where do those kids end up? They end up, again, at the neighborhood school. So we just need to look closely at the data and ask the right questions of it.
Do you think, speaking of that, you know, a lot of the place where our data comes from is the testing. And we are in a big testing debate right now. This week marks the beginning of ISAT testing, our state accountability testing. You should know you're in a city where, according to activists, we have 1,000 parents who've opted their children out of the testing. We have teachers in 2 schools who have said they will not give the test, which I don't know has happened before for an accountability test, a state accountability test. That's a fairly serious stance for the teachers to take. Well, can you talk a little bit about testing and what role you think that should play? Should it be part of education at all?
Well, you know, it has to be part of education, right? Because the only way you can know whether or not a child has learned something is if you test them. If you have to assess, right? We assess at the university. We assess, you know, and it's a part of learning. The problem is that we've taken assessment should be treated as a tool, right? A tool that's used best when it's used for diagnostic purposes, right? That is, we assess to figure out what more does the student need to learn so that we are making sure that the student, goes back to the young lady's question, is prepared, right? Right now, what we do is the kids get tested in the spring, teachers get the results in the fall when they no longer even have the kids, right? That means the ability to use the information to address the student's needs is lost. So what we've been doing is using testing to rank and to monitor, which is the least effective way to use a test. And now if you use it to then judge a teacher or a school, it's even more distorted, right, of what we're doing. So it's not a question of whether or not to test, it's a question of how we test and how we use it. And using it as a weapon, I would say, is the least effective way of all, which is what we've been doing.
Okay. All right.
Let's thank both.
Thank you.